Hey guys, so we are beginning the next book. It is The Psychology of Adoption. Now, this is technically a textbook. It is 18 chapters written by a collection of different psychologists. I am going to skip the forward just to be aware, and I'm only going to be uploading limited time because the chapters are extremely long. So please stay tuned. So we will be doing, I think, one chapter a week. I will correct that down below in the description if I'm wrong. I don't have the calendar in front of me as I film. So this was written back in 1990. Was the last publication of this. So just be aware that this is still relatively old. It's like my age. Well, a little bit older. Anyway, so some things are kind of outdated, but some things are not. So I just want you guys to be aware of that. I will be reading other works by David M. Brodzinsky, who is one of the editors with Marshall D. Schechter. We really do need an updated textbook for adoption. In fact, a lot of social work schools have very limited information on adoption, and they do like maybe a day or two, and they don't take into the perspective of the adoptee. So I just want you all to be aware of that. Anyway, we are beginning with part 1 of the book, which is called Theoretical Perspectives on Adoption Adjustment. Chapter 1 is called A Stress and Coping Model of Adoption Adjustment, written by David M. Brodzinsky. Also, I do recommend getting the book for the resources, and every single contributor is a psychiatrist, psychologist, or a social worker who has dealt with adoptees. All right, with that being said, we are going to begin reading chapter 1. In the past 2 decades, social casework personnel, clinicians, and researchers alike have begun to pay increased attention to the psychological complications associated with adoption. Their attention has been prompted by numerous reports of high rates of referral of adopted children and youth to outpatient and inpatient mental health facilities. For example, although adopted children constitute approximately 2% of the total population, which still rings true today, in the United States, this was as of 1985, but just letting you guys know, it's still relatively the same. They represent between 4 and 5% of the children referred to outpatient and mental health facilities, according to a research done in both 1980 and 1973. And between 10 to 15% of the children in residential care facilities, which was done in 1986. Again, some of those rates have increased. We're still around 2 to 3% of the population, but the referral of outpatient and inpatient have significantly increased. So I have to find the actual stats. I believe it's about 40% of inpatient. And I don't know about outpatient, but I believe it was 40% of inpatient residential care facilities. Anyway, research on the symptomology represented by children referred to clinics also indicates that adoptees are more likely than their non-adopted counterparts to display a variety of acting out problems. For example, aggression, stealing, lying, oppositional behavior, running away, hyperactivity, low self-esteem, and a host of learning difficulties. And now that research was done throughout the years. Oh my God, there's a lot of studies here. Let's see, 1982, 1986, 1967, 1975, 1965, 1969, 1964, 1970, 1966, and 1975 again. All right. Even research with non-clinical community-based samples suggests somewhat greater psychological vulnerability for adopted children as compared to non-adopted children. Now, this was done in both 1987, 1984, 1982, 1980, 1972, 1985, twice. Yeah. Although admittedly the data are less consistent for those types of studies. So again, this is why I suggest getting the book yourself so you can actually look up the different studies. I will eventually go through all the different studies, but it's going to take a very long time. So stay with me. Moreover, the increased vulnerability of adopted children generally does not emerge until the elementary school years, 1987. Assuming that adopted children are at increased risk for various psychological and academic problems, the obvious question that needs to be addressed is the basis for their vulnerability. Mental health professionals have offered a variety of theoretical explanations for the problems manifested by adoptees. Psychodynamic theorists, on the one hand, have focused their attention on the aspects of adoption experience that complicate coping with object loss, the resolution of oedipal conflict, and the development of mature and stable ego. Identity. Again, oh my God, there's so many studies used. Again, 1983, 1980, 1987, 1973, 1985, 1964, 1960, 1975. Okay. Anyway, Kirk's 1964 study, Social Role Theory of Adoption Adjustment, links the problems of adoptees to the failure of their adoptive parents to handle effectively various role handicaps that are inherent part of the adoptive family life. According to Brodzinsky's 1987 study. Cognitive developmental factors have also been offered as components of the adoption adjustment process, particularly as they relate to the child's growing awareness of the meaning of adoption. Now, again, Brodzinsky's 1984, 1987, 1980, 1986, and 1984 study. In addition, ethological theory has emphasized the importance of the attachment separation loss process as fundamental to the problems of many adoptees, particularly those individuals who are placed beyond the infancy years. According to studies in 1951, 1956, 1983, 1973, and 1973. Finally, various researchers have suggested that the problems of the adopted child may have a biological source associated with either the increased genetic vulnerability or prenatal and reproductive complications. According to studies in 1970, 1978, 1982, there's two studies, 1965 and 1964. Although many different perspectives have been offered on the adjustment problems of adopted children and their families, a common thread can be found running through most of them, namely that adoption is experienced as stressful by many children and parents, and consequently results in a variety of coping efforts, some of which are successful in handling the stress and others which are not. In light of this common theme, the growing acceptance of the role of stress and coping in mediating physical and psychological well-being. That is according to studies 1983 and 1984 The remainder of this chapter examines the adjustment process of adopted children and, to a lesser extent, their adoptive parents in terms of stress and a coping model. For an analysis of the adjustment problems of birth parents, we're going to go to chapter 16, which will be in a few weeks, obviously, a few months actually. And you can also see Winkler and Van Keppel's 1984 study. Continuing on. Adoption and the experience of stress. The idea that adoption is a stressful experience runs counter to many prevailing myths and stereotypes about this family life situation. In fact, adoption typically has been viewed as a societal solution for the stress confronting all three parties of the adoption triangle. That is, the stress associated with 1. An unwanted pregnancy on the part of the birth parents, 2. Infertility and childlessness on the part of the adoptive parents, and 3. A state of homelessness and a sense of insecurity on the part of a prospective adopted child. All right, I'm going to pause there. So that is exactly how society, or most of society, still sees it. However, and I say this as a big however, 99% of birth mothers would have parented if they had the proper support and resources. On the hopeful adoptive parents, I should say, nobody is owed a child. You're not owed a biological child, and you're not owed an adopted child. We're going to get that straight. They need therapy just as much as adopted children do. In fact, like I keep saying, everybody needs therapy. There's nothing wrong with it. On the part of 3, what would potentially be the adopted children, aka someone like myself, there are other legal processes that we talk about. There's kinship, fictive kin, and legal guardianship, which are child-centric when external care is necessary. We have to change our societal views. All right, now we're going to continue on into our textbook of adoption. With the placement of the child in the adoptive family, it has often been assumed that the various parties of the adoption triangle simply go their way to live happily ever after. Although many members of the adoption triangle do seem to adjust quite well to their adoption-related experiences, or they adjust for only so long, let's put it that way. We know now that a sizable percentage, i.e. majority, of them continue to have a stressful time in dealing with adoption issues in the post-placement period. And this is according to studies in 1979 and 1978. Before describing why adoption is experienced as stressful by many adopted children and their parents, it is important to first define what is meant by stress and understanding its relationship to adaptational outcomes. The concept of stress has been the center of considerable controversy for some time. The numerous definitions of this construct have been offered. Some theorists have focused on stress as a stimulus or stressor, according to a 1967 study. In this context, stress is equated with environmental events that produce undesirable consequences for the individual. Natural disasters and man-made catastrophes like war, family disruption such as the death and divorce, loss of a job, and so on, are all examples of stressors within this perspective. As Lazarus and Folkman, which is a 1984 study, have noted, however, this approach is rather narrow, since it tends to ignore individual differences in vulnerability to such events. Moreover, it also tends to equate stressors with major life events, and thus avoids dealing with chronic stressors or with the daily hassles that are known to irritate and distress many people, that have been shown to be very important in the adaptation on health. According to the same study that I mentioned above, Lazarus and Folkman, 1984, as well as a Lazarus study with other fellows in 1982. A second approach to defining stress, which typically has been associated with biology and medicine, has focused on response or outcome variables. According to Sully, study in 1950 and 1976. From this perspective, something is stressful if it produces a characteristic psychological outcome, like increased heart rate and respiration, elevated cortisoids, for example. Like the stimulus-oriented definition, this approach also suffers from various shortcomings. Lazarus Folkman's 1984 study notes that the perspective ignores the fact that the same type of response, like elevated heart rate, can occur for different reasons. Thus, without reference to a specific stimulus, it is difficult to know whether a particular response should be judged as a psychological stress reaction. Furthermore, these authors also point out that this approach restricts our ability to define stress prospectively. In other words, we can never know ahead of time whether something will be stressful or not. We must await the individual's reaction to the event to determine whether it is stressful. A more useful approach to understanding stress has been offered by Lazarus and his colleagues in both his 1985 and 1984 study. This approach not only considers the interaction of stimulus and response components of stress, but also incorporates cognitive appraisal processes, coping style and defense mechanisms, and the social context into a comprehensive model of the role of stress in the development of physical and psychological illness. Although it is beyond the scope of this chapter to describe this model in detail, a brief overview is warranted since it forms the basis for the model of adoption adjustment presented here. Lazarus and his colleagues have placed considerable importance on the role of cognitive appraisal in understanding the link between stress and adaptational outcomes. Two forms of cognitive appraisal have been described by these investigators. Primary appraisal refers to the evaluation of the potential impact of the event on the individual. Three kinds of evaluations have been distinguished. 1. The event is irrelevant to one's well-being. 2. The event is benign, positive to one's well-being. And 3. The event is stressful, i.e. viewed as representing harm or loss, threat or challenge, and therefore is potentially damaging to one's well-being. By contrast, secondary appraisal refers to judgments concerning possible steps that can be taken to meet the demands of the stressful event. In other words, this form of appraisal involves a subjective evaluation of the individual's coping options. In addition to cognitive appraisal, Lazarus and his coworkers also have emphasized the role of coping strategies in mediating adaptational outcomes. These investigators have defined coping as constantly changing cognitive and behavioral efforts to manage specific external and/or internal demands, and are appraised as taxing or exceeding the resources of the person, which is a quote from Lazarus and Folkman 1984 study on page 184. From this perspective, coping is viewed as a process, one that can either facilitate or impede successful adaptational outcomes. Two forms of coping are differentiated. Problem-focused coping strategies are directed at managing or altering the problem causing the stress. These strategies are similar to those used in more general forms of problem solving and involve such efforts as altering environmental pressures, barriers, resources, and the like. In addition, Problem-focused coping also can be directed inward in an attempt to produce motivational or cognitive changes, such as altering one's level of aspiration, reducing one's ego involvement, or developing new standards of behavior. By contrast, emotion-focused coping strategies are directed at regulating emotional response to the problem at hand. These strategies can involve attempts to reduce emotional distress by such means as avoidance, minimization, distancing, selective attention, positive comparison, and so on. Or the strategies can increase emotional distress as a way of mobilizing oneself for action. Furthermore, certain emotion-focused coping strategies are directed at bringing about a change in the meaning of the stressful event. In such case, coping involves a rephrasal or redefinition of the event as less threatening than was the first thought. Finally, Lazarus and his colleagues argue that cognitive appraisal processes and coping strategies are highly influenced by a host of personal variables and environmental variables. For example, the individual's values, commitments, goals, and general beliefs, including self-esteem, mastery, sense of control, and interpersonal trust, are assumed to interact with various environmental demands, constraints, and resources, otherwise known as social support, to produce divergent appraisals as to whether the stimulus event in question is potentially stressful, and if so, what the person can do to cope with it, thus integrating person variables with the environment conditions. Being faced with cognitive appraisal processes provide the basis of the individual differences in response to the psychological stress reactions. And that's according to Lazarus's 1985 study. All right, so pausing there. Basically, what he's saying that is there a whole bunch of studies done specifically by Lazarus talking about different stressors, the different variables, and how one copes with it. Now, with that being said, with adoption, as what we know now, again, this was the last time this was published was 1990. So obviously the studies are older in comparison to when I'm reading it now than it was back when it was published. Is that we found out that adoption in itself, the maternal separation, is trauma, right? And we talk about this because it's important to recognize that it is trauma for both the adoptee as well as for the birth parent, the birth mother. And what we know now through other studies, such as a study done on NICU babies, as well as, what we know now about child development, is the first 3 months of a child's life is known as the fourth trimester. All that baby knows during that pregnancy is the mother's voice, the mother's smell, and the mother's heartbeat. So the baby, and this goes for all babies, right, that are born, instantly need to be skin to skin with their biological mother if possible. And again, I say if possible because obviously there's factors. As quickly as possible, I should say, because that is how they bond. And so they're secure. They feel a sense of security. They feel like they are, again, back in the womb, and have a security, as they begin to grow. Now, I know a lot of adoptees are out there who are like, well, it wasn't trauma to me, or I don't feel traumatized. Here's the thing. There's something called the fog. And I will have to do a whole quick little video one of these weeks, when I'm not reading on a day I'm not reading. I'll post it, I promise, about what the fog means. And if you have been following me and you've been watching my shorts that I post, whether it's here or on TikTok, I talk about the different trauma responses. The thing is that you cannot necessarily say you're traumatized or not unless you recognize it. And oftentimes these adoptees who are like, well, I'm not traumatized, they may say that, but they don't recognize that there is trauma. They don't recognize their trauma responses. They don't understand that a lot of times we use certain coping things, as we talk about with the traumas, the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn responses are automatic coping skills. And it's okay to be like, well, I don't know if it really affects me. Or, maybe they are happy being adopted, and that's okay. But oftentimes they are not well aware of it, and they try to use their experience without actually having done the healing work against the majority, against those that are speaking out on the harms. And that is where we have a huge issue. So it's important to continue to do inner healing work. And again, that's whether you're adopted or not. Healing your inner child is super important. And it's for adults of all ages, But there is a certain part of adoptees that we never had, at least from birth, we never had that chance to have that security. All right, we're going to continue moving on. So in this part of chapter 1, we're talking about the loss as a source of stress in adoption. A primary assumption of this chapter is that the adoption involves loss, which in turn creates stress for the child and thereby increases his or her vulnerability for emotional and behavioral problems, according to Brodzinsky in 1987 study. Although the idea certainly is not new, in the past it has been associated primarily with adoption placements involving the separation of an older child from a caregiver. For example, biological parent or foster parent with whom he or she has an attachment relationship, according to studies done in 1969, 1979, 1978, and 1983. Here, the concept of loss is incorporated into a model of adjustment for the children who are placed for adoption during the first few months of their life. This is what's called traditional adoption, or also known as privatized infant adoption, prior to the time when they have developed primary attachments. The experience of loss among adopted children placed as infants has often gone unrecognized. So, pausing there, I know I'm in the middle of a sentence. They considered this the blank slate theory, right? So the blank slate theory is basically, well, if a child is born and you place it for or he, she, baby, is placed for adoption right away, it could be a few hours, could be a few months, that, not even a few months, a few weeks, few days, that they're going to have this blank slate and not remember their biological parents. That has been not true. Like I said before, just a little bit ago, that we now recognize that this, maternal separation affects us even from day one. But a lot of people still think that this theory works that way, but it doesn't. It really doesn't. It's problematic that we, as society as a whole, haven't figured that out. All right, sorry. So where was I? Unrecognized by mental health professionals and laypersons alike. Too often, it has been assumed that adopted children cannot feel loss for individuals like the biological parents they have never known. In recent years, through adoption specialists have come to appreciate the unique role played by the loss in the psychological adjustment of even those children given homes when they were infants, according to a 1980 study, 1987, and 1985. This is not to suggest, however, that the experience of loss among early and late place adopted children is the same. To be sure, loss due to separation from an attachment figure is not only more overt, according to Nickman's 1985 study, but is assumed to be more traumatic, thereby creating greater stress and vulnerability for the child. Moreover, to the extent that the child experiences multiple separations from attachment figures, as he or she moves through foster care system, this form of loss probably can be considered a provoking agent that contributes directly to the Sorry, my phone is about to die, so I'm going to finish this one little paragraph before I pause for a while. I lost where I was. I was in the middle of saying developmental. I'm struggling. Let's see. Directly to the development of psychopathology, according to a 1978 and 1982 study. Conversely, a loss associated with early adoption placement is covert, according to Nickman's 1985 study, and subtle and emerges slowly in the time of conjunction with the child's growing awareness of the meaning and implications of having been adopted, according to Brodzinsky's 1987. Moreover, this form of loss, being less traumatic, is not as likely to lead to psychopathology by itself, but increases the child's vulnerability to other pathogenic experiences, according to a 1978 and 1982 study. All right, we are starting back up. In stating that adoption involves loss, let us be clear about what exactly this sense of loss entails. Simply put, adopted children, once they come to realize the implications of being adopted, not only experience a loss of their biological parents and origins, but also a loss of stability in the relationship to their adoptive parents, which is done in studies from 1980, 1987, and 1985. In addition, there is a loss of self from Brodzinsky 1987 and genealogical continuity, Sant's study of 1964. Adopted children also experience status loss associated with being different, which is from the studies by Kirk in 1964 and Nickman in 1985. These various losses often leave the adoptee feeling incomplete, alienated, disconnected, abandoned, or unwanted. Furthermore, the sense of loss typically leads to a characteristic pattern of emotional and behavioral reactions commonly associated with grieving. Balby from 1973 and 1980. In fact, Brodzinsky in 1987 had suggested that much of what had been called pathogenic in the adopted child's behavior is nothing more than the unrecognized manifestation of an adoptive grieving process. So it's been, how do I explain it? I feel like we've already explained it. We have to grieve, right? We have to recognize that it's a huge loss, and the issue is that even in 2023, this is still not widely recognized. We're still talking about it and still trying to get people to understand that this is important for adoptive parents to recognize. It's important for society to recognize. It's important for birth parents to recognize and biological family. But one thing that has been brought up is like the idea of gotcha day. So a lot of adoptive parents, not all, but a lot, feel like they want to celebrate their child's adoption day or gotcha day. And it's extremely problematic because for adoptees, most of us, I'm not going to say all of us, unless your child specifies that they want to do it, please don't push it, because it is the day that we grieve the loss of our biological family. So we grieve all the time, but it's like an extra painful day, as well as our birthdays. All right, anyway, comparing loss and adoption, parental divorce, and parental death. The significance of loss as a central factor underlying children's adjustment is certainly not restricted to adoption. In fact, loss has been conceptualized as a fundamental explanatory construct in children's adjustment into many forms of family disruption and life transition. And this is from Bloom-Feshbach in 1987. This is not to suggest, however, that the experience of loss is the same in reaction to different life circumstances, for clearly it is not. As a stressor, loss associated with the family disruption and life transition varies along a number of dimensions, including degree of acuteness, pervasiveness, permanence, universality, public recognition of loss, and so on. So, in an attempt to provide a clearer picture of the role of loss in the adjustment of adopted children, it is instructive to compare it with the experience of loss associated with the other, more common forms of family disruption, parental divorce, and parental death. And this is from Wallerstein, 1983, for similar comparison of these two forms of family disruption. All right. Adoption, parental divorce, and parental death differ on at least 6 dimensions. Consider the first dimension, universality. Death is a universal experience. Not only will we all die, but in the process of growing up, it is inevitable that we will be exposed to death of significant others, grandparents, parents, friends, acquaintances, and so on. As Wallerstein, in his 1983 study, notes, each person finds both terror and comfort in the recognition that the same fate awaits us all, on page 273. By contrast, divorce and adoption, like most other losses, are not universal experiences. Nowadays, divorce is so common in our society that nearly all children whose parents separate eventually divorce. Know others who have had similar experiences. This is often not the case in adoption. Stopping there. So as said before in the beginning of this chapter, again, adoptees still only make up 2 to 3% of the population. So remember that, 2 to 3% of the population. That's not a whole lot. All right. Anyway, let's continue on. Because relatively few children in our society are adopted, there is a greater likelihood that adoptees will feel more alone with their losses. In turn, this may well foster feelings of differentness that can undermine self-esteem and psychological well-being. Adoption and divorce also differ from parental death in terms of permanence. One, on the other hand, loss due to death is final. That is irreversible. Although young children do not understand this aspect of death, I actually disagree with that. Children do, or most children do. By the time they reach the early elementary school years, they generally have mastered it. Yeah, okay, so they do agree eventually. And that's according to Spies and Brent, 1984. On the other hand, most children recognize the loss due to divorce and adoption are at least potentially reversible. For in fact, the non-custodial parent in divorce and the surrendering parents in adoption usually are alive. Okay, pausing there. So a lot of people think that adoption is irreversible, or reversible, that you can undo an adoption. The thing is, you cannot legally undo an adoption. You have to be adopted again, which doesn't solve the issue. Now, he is about to go on in terms of reunion. Now, that is sometimes possible. Most of the time it's possible, I should say. But it's usually only with one parent and not with both. So there is partly a problem. Now, when it comes to divorce, there's usually a parenting plan. I'm actually dealing with this now through family court. Not that I'm divorced, but this is something that is fairly common, right? Is so that your child can see the other parent. Anyway, we're continuing on. Certainly, hope of reunion with the lost person is a theme of much of a fantasy life of children who experienced divorce and adoption. In divorce, this hope, which typically includes a desire for parental reunification, often is reinforced by the ongoing contact between the child and the non-custodial parent. Wallerstein, 1983. Although such contact can make it difficult at first for the child to acknowledge the reality of the divorce, in the long run, it typically fosters healthy adjustment on the child's part than in cases where the child has little, if any, contact with the non-custodial parent. Adopted children also fantasizes about undoing their loss. That's very true. Fantasies about reunions with birth parents and birth siblings are extremely common among adopted children and adults. We also fantasize about it. As they grow growing up. The fact that these fantasies potentially can come true, which is reinforced by the well-publicized search efforts of adult adoptees and birth parents, may well serve to impede the resolution of loss among many adopted individuals. There's still a loss, and reunions are extremely difficult. So while there is a fantasy, I feel like the reunion part is very complex that we don't discuss enough. Anyway, continuing on. A third dimension differentiating adoption, divorce, and death is the child's relationship with the lost person or persons. Children who experience parental death generally have a history of interaction with these individuals. Consequently, there are memories of the parent or of their shared experiences, as well as memories of the circumstances surrounding the parent's death that can be drawn on in coming to terms with the loss. In divorce, too, there is typically a history of a relationship with the lost parent, as well as a history of experiencing various conditions of family life that may have contributed to parental divorce. These experiences, along with the possibility of an ongoing relationship with the non-custodial parent, can make it easier for the child to understand the basis for the loss, and therefore how to come to terms with it. Adopted children, in contrast, are at a disadvantage in comparison to other children who have lost parents, because the original relinquishment typically occurs in infancy. Adoptees seldom have memories of their birth parents and the circumstances surrounding their adoptive placement. They also have a frequently prevented from gaining greater insight into their past because of the adoptive parent's anxiety in discussing the relinquishment, as well as the reluctance of the adoption agencies to share relevant information with the adoptive family. So that's very true. Like I said, while we were reading the last book, The Girls Who Went Away, oftentimes, at least before the 90s, open adoption was not really a thing. And it has slowly become a marketing ploy, but it is not legally binding in any state. Yes, it is not legally binding in any state. Now, some people will be like, oh, but, there's this law. I think Pennsylvania has a law that is more in line with making it legally binding. That being said, the judges typically do, they side with the adoptive parents more than anything. So it's still a problem. And then adoption agencies, if they're not shut down, they make it almost impossible. The state laws make it almost impossible to gain information. A lot of this information is not only crucial to our identity, it's crucial to our medical history, it's crucial to who we are and how we survive, and we cannot be lied to. We can't be authentic without that information. And by the way, even with all that information and even with open adoptions, which 1% actually last past the age of 5, that doesn't diminish the trauma and the loss that we experience. So I just want to make that very clear. All right, anyway. Thus, that which is lost to the adopted child is often unknown. This lack of knowledge tends to foster misperceptions and distortions of the birth parents and the circumstances of the relinquishment. As a result, the lost birth parents often linger as ghosts in the mental and emotional life of adopted persons and prevent them from achieving some satisfactory resolution of their loss. The issue of whether the loss was the result of voluntary versus involuntary circumstances also is a dimension that differentiates these various forms of family disruption. Adoption and divorce, unlike death, involve presumed voluntary decisions on the part of the parents. So pausing there, it's like said, presumed. The issue is that 99% of adoptions shouldn't have been signed, and meaning the birth parent, the birth mother, did not want to give the child up if they had the support and resources. Less than 1% admit to the unwanted, parenting plan. And that is why they signed it. So, and often birth parents are coerced and lied to and misled about the better life that the child will have when it's not true. Anyway, let's continue on. As Wallerstein, 1983, notes, this knowledge can be a burden for the child and foster feelings of intense anger towards the parents. It also can be the basis of considerable guilt and self-blame. For example, if only I were good, Daddy wouldn't have left. Or if only I were good, my birth parents wouldn't have given me up for adoption. Pausing there. Please do not blame yourself if your parents had a divorce or you were an adoptee. It is never the child's fault. And yes, I've seen disgusting comments towards adoptees about, oh, well, too bad your parents gave you up. Maybe there's a reason you're hateful. And that's really gross. If you're listening, please don't ever say that. That's just disgusting. Like, you just make a horrible human being, right? Anyway, continuing on. Although anger and guilt are also seen in children's response to parental death, these reactions usually are less intense and less prolonged, probably because they are not reinforced by the very real possibility of restoration, represented by living parents. Although adoption, divorce, and death all involve loss, the extent of the loss is greater in adoption. In death, there is a permanent loss of a single parent. Divorce, too, involves the loss of a single parent, although the loss typically is not permanent and may be partially undone through regular visitation. Also, very rarely, some do end up remarrying, whether it's remarrying each other or remarrying someone else. There are step-parent adoptions, which is also problematic, but there are step-parents which can help a little bit if you have a good relationship. But anyway, where were we? Furthermore, it is more common for children who experience parental death and divorce to feel some sense of family loss. Although the presence of the surviving parent or the custodial parent as well as siblings and other extended family, helps to offset this feeling. In adoption, the loss is more pervasive. Although perhaps less obvious, not only do adopted children experience the loss of birth parents and the extended birth family, as well as the loss of cultural and genealogical heritage, but for many adoptees, there is a loss of sense of permanence and connectedness to their adoptive family, as well as a loss of self and social status. A final dimension differentiating these forms of family disruption concerns the extent of societal and community acknowledgement of loss and the support offered to the bereaved person. Death is a universally recognized loss. Every society and culture not only acknowledges the loss involved in death, but provides a variety of rituals and support, like funerals, wakes, burials, religious ceremonies, etc., to help the individual both acknowledge and mourn the loss. By contrast, mental health professionals have noted the lack of readily available supports to help the child and adults deal with divorce-related losses. And that's according to Wallerstein in his 1983 and 1980 studies. In a similar vein, those individuals who experience loss because of adoption are often lacking in the necessary rituals and emotional support that would help them move through the mourning process. In fact, I would argue that public recognition and acceptance of loss in adoption, at least traditional adoption, involving placement in infancy, is even less than in the case of divorce. The consequence of the diminished support is that it makes it more difficult for the adoptee to consciously acknowledge to themselves their sense of loss, as well as find effective ways of coping with their sorrow and loneliness. To summarize, although adoption, parental divorce, and parental death all involve significant loss for the child, the nature of loss differs considerably in each of these circumstances. In my clinical experience, the pervasiveness of loss in adoption, coupled with the diminished societal recognition and support for this loss, as well as the realization that restoration of a relationship with the lost individuals is a possibility, combine to complicate the grieving process for the adoptee. Okay, so I'm going to post this model that we are going to be talking about now, so you can have a representation. A model of stress and coping in adoption. In this figure represents a schematic representation of our current thinking about adoption, adjustment in terms of a stress and coping model. Before describing the various components of the model and elaborating on a number of them, 2 points must be made. First, the present model, as noted, draws heavily on the work of Lazarus and his colleagues from his 1982, 1985, and 1984 studies, wow, I can't think today, as well as our own previous work on cognitive, developmental, and psychological factors in adoption adjustment from Brodzinsky's 1984, 1987, 1980, 1988, 1984 again, and 1986 studies. Second, although the current model is believed to have substantial integrative and generative value, it still must be considered speculative and most certainly incomplete, given the paucity of research on children's adoption adjustment. As noted earlier, a primary assumption of the present model is that adoption leads to an experience of loss on the part of the child. Although this is believed to be universal among adoptees, the extent to which the loss is experienced as stressful obviously varies from child to child. Whereas some children are severely distressed over the loss of birth parents, origins, and so on, others show minimal reactions to their losses. I just want to say it also depends on the age of the child, the information given, because I can tell you that when I was, say, 5, I didn't feel that loss. When I was age, I think 8, my adoptive mom said I was bothered by it, but I wanted nothing to do with her. By age 17, 18, I remember feeling significant loss. 21, even more. And now in my 30s, and knowing more and more about everything, I just feel it all the time. And I'm disgusted, not by my own personal experience, but by the studies and the government, the laws associated, just everything behind it is just, it's so gross knowing all of this information and the fact that we allow this to continue. All right, anyway. Explaining the wide array of reactions to the experience of adoption-related losses constitutes the primary challenge for any model of adoption adjustment. At the heart of the current model is the assumption that children's adjustment to adoption, both short-term and long-term outcome, is mediated by various cognitive appraisal processes and coping efforts. Cognitive appraisal includes both the children's interpretation of the meaning of being adopted, including its potential as a stressor, as well as a subjective evaluation of the options available to the child for dealing with the conflict, demands, challenges, and so on that are part of the adoption experience. Coping efforts include a variety of strategies that are activated in response to the perceived stress of adoption, such as some of these strategies are thought to be problem focused, like instrumental action, negotiation, mobilizing support, information seeking, altering one's aspirations or expectations, and exercising restraint. And others are thought to be emotional based, like minimization, denial, escapism, distancing, self-blame, and redefinition. Impacting on the cognitive appraisal process are a host of personal related variables. Among the more important of these variables are the child's self-esteem, sense of mastery and control, interpersonal trust values, and level of cognitive functioning. In addition, 2 sets of background variables are posted as influencing the adoption adjustment process. These include biological factors such as the child's genetic endowment and prenatal and reproductive experiences, as well as various environmental I just lost my place. Environmental factors such as general familial and peer socialization experiences, and various cultural and situational demands, constraints, and resources specifically associated with adoption. And finally, it should be noted that the current model is recursive in nature. As such, it is assumed that short-term adaptational outcomes influence various person variables directly as well as indirectly through their impact on more general environmental experiences. Having outlined the basis of the model, let us turn now to some of the specifics. In previous work, my colleagues and I have emphasized the role of cognitive developmental factors in children's knowledge and reactions to their adoptive status. Brodzinsky, in his study 1984, 1987, 1980, 1984 again, and 1986, we've argued that adopted children's adjustment is mediated in part by their emerging comprehension of the meaning of adoption, including their awareness of adoption-related losses and their evaluation of the basis for their relinquishment. This assumption places a great deal of emphasis on the interface between person variables, level of which is like the level of cognitive functioning, and appraisal and coping processes. It also incorporates the stress and coping model into a developmental framework because of its centrality within the present model. We turn now to the role of cognitive developmental factors in children's sensitivity to and appraisal of adoption-related losses. The relinquishment of a young baby by a biological mother and the subsequent placement of that child with the adoptive couple does not by itself produce a sense of loss in the experience of the newly placed infant. In traditional adoption, so privatized infant adoption, where the child's primary attachments are formed in the adoptive family, the emergence of sense of loss grows slowly and typically does not appear until the elementary school years. So pausing there, this has been proven untrue, but again, this was written in the 90s. So this developmental pattern has been well documented in the research by the author and his co-workers in 1984 study, 1987 study, 1984, and 1986. So again, this was still written during when blank slate theory was thought to be true. And although they were beginning to come to the realization that it wasn't, they still thought that babies couldn't feel loss. They thought that a baby was taken from infancy could reattach, have an attachment to the adoptive parents. So I just want to make that clear. All right, continuing on. In the preschool years, when the adoptive couples begin to disclose adoption information to their children, there is little evidence of any immediate adverse reaction to the information. In fact, young adopted children often have a very positive view of adoption. This is by Singer, Brodzinsky, and Braff in 1982. Their initial reaction to their family status is based on two factors. First, they generally are told about being adopted in the context of a warm, loving, and protective family environment. Thus, the emotional climate surrounding the telling process is one which factors acceptance and positive self-regard. A second and very important factor in the young child's positive attitude about adoption is his or her limited cognitive ability. Our research suggests that most children do not understand the meaning of being adopted until age 5 to 7. And even though their understanding is quite limited, according to Brodzinsky's 1984 study, although younger children may well be able to describe the events leading to their adoption, like having been born to another woman, flying on an airplane to the United States from wherever they were born, such as Korea, meeting a new mommy and daddy. In most cases, these descriptions mask a conspicuous absence of knowledge. The young child's verbal report typically represents little more than the ability to repeat, often with considerable accuracy, the adoption story presented by parents. Thus, it is understandable that young adopted children show less distress regarding their adoptive family status. The combination of a warm emotional climate surrounding the initial telling process and the young child's cognitive limitations almost assures that the adoption information received by the child will be accepted in a positive light. So that's exactly what my parents did, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing because how do I explain this? Of course, you want to tell your child's story to them without putting a negative spin on it. You want them to accept the reality and obviously be age appropriate, but at the same time, we have to understand that when society says, oh, well, all these young kids love being adopted. Yeah, because that's all they've ever known. They don't understand the harm being done. They're typically not in reunion. They're not understanding the full impact that adoption does. So while a child that's like 7, and like we've talked about this, a child that's 7 could be happy with their adoption, a child that's, 17 could not be. An adult could not be. It can change at any moment. Anyway, moving on. As children enter the elementary school years, however, a number of important changes occur. The impact significantly on adoption adjustment during the developmental period, which roughly corresponds to Bagot's concrete operational stage. Children are becoming increasingly reflective, analytic, planful, and logical in their approach to the world. According to Brain and Ruman in 1983, another study by Bransford Ferreira and Campone in 1983, and Gelman and Ballargin 1983, Kogan 1983, and Shantz 1983. So a bunch of studies in 1983. As part of this growth in cognitive and social cognitive reasoning, children's knowledge of adoption also undergoes important changes. Not only do children clearly differentiate between adoption and birth as alternative ways to entering a family, but they gain new insights into the implications of being adopted. For example, whereas preschool children tend to define a family in terms of the people who live together, by the elementary school years, most children view members as individuals who share blood, like biological, according to a study in 1986 and 1964. The new way of looking at the family fosters increased recognition and appreciation of the lack of biological connectedness between the child and the adoptive parents, which in turn often creates confusion and stress on the part of the child and undermines his or her sense of security and permanence in the family. And this is according to Brodzinsky's 1984 and 1986 study. Another new insight into adoption that emerges at this time is the child's recognition of relinquishment. Preschool-aged children tend to focus primarily on being adopted by their parents, that is, being incorporated into their new family. This focus parallels the nature of the story presented by adoptive parents, which emphasizes aspects of family building and minimizes aspects concerning the birth mother's surrender of the child. As children mature cognitively, however, their capacity for understanding logical reciprocity leads them to a profound insight to be adopted. One first must be relinquished or surrendered. Thus, in the elementary school years, children view adoption not only in terms of family building, but also in terms of family loss. The child's sense of loss is associated with adoption is accompanied by many behavioral, emotional, and attitudinal changes. To begin with, children no longer view adoption in such a positive light. Singer's 1982 reported that by 8 years of age, most adopted children experience considerable ambivalence about being adopted. In addition to this attitudinal change, numerous professionals have commented on the increase in anger, aggression, oppositional behavior, uncommunicativeness, depression, and self-image problems that emerged during this time among many adoptees. And that is also according to Brennick's 1980 study. In Brodzinsky's 1987 study, Nickman's 1985 study, and Brodzinsky's 1987 study again, has suggested this behavioral and emotional pattern reflects a process of adaptive grief, a response to the recognition that one has lost something significant. Moreover, as the individual moves into adolescence, the sense of loss may deepen. No longer is the experience of loss restricted primarily to one's birth parents. With the development of higher order cognitive functions, adolescents begin to reevaluate the loss in terms of their emerging identity. At this time, a loss of self often is experienced as well as a loss of connectedness to a genealogical line. These new losses contribute to the behavioral and emotional reactions associated with the grieving process. All right, so pausing right there. Oftentimes, schools, elementary school age, they do these family trees. Now, I don't really remember doing one at that age, but I do hear other adoptees going through it, and it can be extremely problematic. I remember beginning to work on my genealogical line in my 20s. No, maybe it was a little before that. It was definitely before that. Now I'm thinking. I was like 14? Maybe it was like 14. Because it was my cousin, also adopted, and my grandma, our grandma, on my mom's side, working on it before she passed. So yeah, it was probably like 14, and we're still working on it. But again, this is my adopted side. This isn't even my biological side. But I do hear a lot, oftentimes, that those that have to do it for school feel horrible about it. Anyway, continuing on. To summarize, the present model assumes that adopted children's adjustment is mediated by the gradual emergence of various cognitive and social cognitive capabilities. In other words, until adopted children have reached the stage where they are cognitively mature enough to reflect on their unknown past and their unknown parents, until their origins and the circumstances surrounding the relinquishment take on a reality within a well-developed representational system. There is little basis for expecting that they will experience adoption-related losses and the subsequent behavior and emotional reactions for the grieving process. Similar points have been made by other writers who have emphasized the role of mental processes in children's development and maintenance of attachment relationships and their subsequent response to separation and loss, such as Bloom, Feshbach in 1987, Bowlby's 1969, 1973, and 1980 works, Main, Kaplan, and Cassidy's 1985 work. Alright, continuing on. Oh God. Other person variable impacting on appraisal and adjustment. Besides level of cognitive functioning, there are a number of other person variables that are assumed to influence the child's adjustment to adoption: self-esteem, self-efficacy, and the child's sense of control are three variables commonly associated with one another that are believed to mediate the adoption's appraisal and coping process. Clinical experience suggests that children with low self-esteem, low feelings of efficacy, and a diminished sense of personal control tend to evaluate their adoption experience more negatively and utilize coping strategies that produce less satisfying adaptational outcomes. In particular, it is quite common to find these children engaging in self-blame for their relinquishment, which in turn often produces depressive affect, withdrawal, and uncommunicative behavior. Conversely, other children with problems in self-esteem, self-efficacy, or perceived control project blame outward, either toward the birth parents or the adoptive parents. In this case, difficulties in adaptational outcome tend to be more externalizing in nature. For example, anger, aggression, oppositional behavior, lying, stealing, and so on, according to Brodzinsky's 1987 study. Two other person variables also need to be mentioned: the child's sense of interpersonal trust and the degree of commitment to the adoptive family are believed to be powerful forces, shaping the appraisal and coping process. These two variables are part of the more general process of attachment, which numerous writers have discussed. In the context of adoption adjustment, in Brodzinsky's 1987 study, Fallberg's 1979 study, Singer, Brodzinsky, Ramsey, Steer, and Waters, 1985, Steinher, 1983, Yarrow and Goodwin, 1973, Yarrow, Goodwin, Manmere, and Millows, 1973. Although to date we know very little about the role of interpersonal trust and family commitment in the adopted child's adjustment, clinical experience suggests that children who have little trust in or commitment to their adoptive family members are likely to appraise the adoption experience more negatively, feel a greater sense of adoption-related loss, and utilize coping strategies that produce a less satisfying patterns of adjustment. The point is well illustrated by Karen, who is a 15-year-old who was seen in individual therapy by the author. All right, so here's her little story or clinical notes on her. Adopted in infancy, Karen appeared to adjust reasonably well until early elementary years. Around 8 to 9 years of age, however, as her understanding of adoption grew, Karen began to feel disconnected from her parents, especially her father, who was rather demanding and critical person. With time, Karen's sense of trust, and commitment to her adoptive parents lessened. At the time, she displayed an intensely positive attachment to her fantasized biological mother, with whom she strongly identified. In her attempts to resolve the loss of her birth mother, Karen began to display serious oppositional behavior at home and indiscriminate sexual behavior among her peers. With regard to the latter behavior, Karen was quite conscious of her motives to create the conditions of her own relinquishment as to achieve a more satisfactory solution. She acknowledged having frequent fantasies of getting pregnant and caring for a baby, and in doing so, experiencing a sense of nurturance denied her by her birth mother. Pausing there, that is often what happens with adoptees. We have this big sense of wanting biological family. I know I did when I was, a teenager into my early 20s, and then I became a mom, and I'm not gonna lie, it was it definitely satisfied that portion. That's not to say I don't still feel loss. Anyway, sorry. Let's continue. Over the course of therapy, Karen has been able to find more effective coping strategies to resolve her sense of loss. One strategy in particular has been beneficial for her, namely an active search for her birth mother. The search, which still has not achieved her goal of reunion, has increased Karen's self-esteem and sense of control, and greatly improved her relationship with her adoptive parents. It also has resulted in more responsible sexual behavior. Finally, a clarification of the causal link between children's adaptational outcome and various personal variables is warranted, although it may have been suggested that children's self-esteem, sense of personal control, interpersonal trust, and so forth mediate the appraisal of adoption-related loss and their subsequent adoption adjustment. It is also recognized that short-term adaptational outcomes invariable impact on children's self-esteem and other aspects of their personality. In other words, adjustment to adoption is viewed as a transactional process in which persons' variables, appraisal, and coping processes and adaptational outcomes are assumed to have an ongoing interactive influence on one another, as you could see in the figure that we had up before. Alright, so here's some background variables. Having described the link between various person variables and the child's adoption, appraisal, and coping efforts, let us now turn to two sets of background variables that are assumed to influence the adoption adjustment variables. The first one being the biological variable. As noted earlier, the child's adjustment to adoption is believed to be influenced by his or her genetic endowment, as well as prenatal and reproductive experiences. Recently, several writers have argued that the psychological and academic problems of adopted children may have a genetic basis. And that is according to a 1982 book by Dutch. Anyway, the assumption is tied to the frequent reported finding that psychopathology, in adoptees is more strongly related to psychopathology in the biological parents, in opposed to the adoptive parents. Furthermore, at least one study, and that is by Horn, Green, Carney, and Eckerson in 1975, found that unwed mothers whose children were placed for adoption scored higher on a number of clinical scales on a Minnesota multifaceted personality inventory than did the adoptive parents of these children. To the extent that the problems measured by the scales have a genetic component, it could be argued on the one hand that the findings support the position that adoptees come from a less optimal hereditary background than their non-adopted counterparts. So basically, they're talking about eugenics. Although this argument has a certain compelling quality to it, it should be noted that a more recent follow-up study by Horn in 1975 investigation found that the more disturbed unwed mothers produced children who were calmer and more secure in their adoptive homes. And that was according as well to a 1982 study. This finding is directly opposed to predictions made by any traditional gene-based explanation of adoption adjustment. On the other hand, according to investigators, it does fit a gene-environment interaction model, whereby the genetic-based vulnerabilities of the child are suppressed and other favorable qualities are encouraged within the warm and supportive adoptive family environment. Like genetic endowment, the child's prenatal and reproductive experiences are also assumed to play an important role in adoption adjustment. The assumption is based on the subsequent literature documenting the negative impact of prenatal and reproductive complications on postnatal development, according to Cope's study in 1983. Since many of these complications are commonly found among young unwed mothers, poor nutrition, poor medical care, substance abuse, high levels of psychological stress, etc., and since the group of women accounts for a sizable percentage of children placed in adoption, it is reasonable to expect that prenatal and reproductive experiences may be important for explaining subsequent developmental problems among adoptees. In support of this assumption, it should be noted that in several studies, a 1970 study, 1971, and 1965, adoptees have been found to have poor prenatal histories compared to non-adopted control groups. At present, there is relatively little information available concerning the extent on the way in which biological factors influence children's adoption adjustment within the current model. Neither of these factors assume to manifest themselves directly. Instead, genetic vulnerabilities and prenatal or reproductive complications are assumed to interact in complex and currently unknown ways with a variety of postnatal environmental factors to produce specific patterns of adoption adjustment. Although the statement must be seen passé within the zeitgeist of current psychological theory, it needs to be emphasized since the role of biological factors, either acting alone or in concert with the environmental factors, has received scant attention on a basis growing evidence of genetic basis for the variety of psychopathological conditions. Future researchers could do well to focus their attention on the role of biological factors in the adjustment of adopted children. As a case in point, consider the findings of Dutch 1982 study, who reported that adoptees are significantly overrepresented among children diagnosed to having attention deficit disorder, ADD. Their data indicated that there is a 32 to 36% chance that a male adoptee would exhibit symptoms of ADD. The comparable figure to female adoptees was 6 to 14%. In attempting to explain the high incidence of the ADD among adopted children, the authors note the substantial amount of alcoholism, sociopathy, and psychopathy and hysteria found among biological relatives of hyperactive adoptees, according to Cantwell's 1975 study. They further noted that ADD, which has a moderate genetic component, according to the same study, often persists into adulthood and contributes to the developmental of sociopathy and psychopathy. The authors argued that these data together with the finding of increased psychopathic tendencies is in unwed mothers who give up their children for adoption, according to Horn's 1975 study, provide strong indirect evidence of a genetic basis for a high incidence of ADD among adoptees. All right, pausing there. Again, this was done in 1990, and it has since come out that adoptees are at a higher rate for neurodivergence. And I just want to say that there's nothing wrong with being neurodivergent. Now, I will admit that part of the chapter feels like an attack on our biological family. Even in the best circumstances, if your birth mother had the best pregnancy or whatever, it's hard because I feel like they still had the stress of giving us up, right? 99% of birth mothers wanted to raise their child. Anyway, continuing on, because this is a very long chapter. Environmental variables. Within the current model, a number of environmental variables are assumed to have a significant influence on the adjustment of adopted children. Among these variables are a host of demands, constraints, and resources associated with the cultural attitudes and practices among adoption, as well as the individual's specific interpersonal adoption experience within the outside of the family. The child's placement history also is assumed to influence subsequent adoption adjustment. The cultural factors. To begin with, consider cultural attitudes concerning adoption. Although adoption is a widely accepted form of substitute care for children whose biological parents could not or would not care for them, there is still a feeling within most cultural groups that it is a second best route to parenthood. And a second best way to entering a family. So that's according to studies in 1964, 1981, 1979, and 1978. And yes, this is exactly what society sees us as. We are a second choice. They will take any baby available that they could get their hands on because they want to build a family. It's not because they think it's in our best interest. They don't actually care what our best interest is. Yeah. This attitude is most clearly seen in such comments such as, "Isn't it too bad you couldn't have a child of your own?" Or, "You are so courageous to raise someone else's child. I don't think I could do it." Comparable remarks made to adopted children include, "Who are your real parents? Do you mind being adopted?" And, "You're so lucky to have been adopted." Again, all of these are harmful to both parties. Adopted parents and their children reported that these insensitive, albeit well-meaning comments, which can come not only from relative strangers, but friends and family members, tend to reinforce in them a sense of being different, of somehow not fitting in, or of even being defective. Thus, to be part of an adoptive family is to be exposed continually to the challenge represented by society's ambivalent attitude about adoption. A challenge that can create a considerable stress among adoptive family members. Cultural attitudes and beliefs concerning adoption also play a role in the child's adjustment process through the standards, rules, and regulations governing adoption system. At the time of the legal finalization of the original birth record is sealed, thereby preventing the adoptee from knowing the truth about his or her origins. Although adoption agencies are beginning to recognize the importance of providing detailed information about birth parents and their families to the adoptive family, there still is considerable resistance among adoption professionals to opening up the whole adoption process. So we're going to talk more about that in Chapter 7, but this is still happening today in 2023, so we're talking 33 years after this book was last published. Still dealing with this. Ridiculous. Anyway, as an example of the difficulties engendered by the current societal attitudes and standards concerning adoption, consider the case of Amy, a 14-year-old adopted privately, non-agency placement in infancy in a small southern town. Amy was brought for psychological consultation by her parents because of depression, social withdrawal, oppositional behavior, and school failure. Amy's parents reported that when she was first told about being adopted around 4 years old, she showed little interest in the topic. During 3rd grade, however, she began to question her parents about the reasons of her relinquishment. These questions intensified over the next few years. And included a desire to know more about her birth mother's family, background, physical characteristics, interests, and more. Amy's parents had little information about the birth family, except some general descriptive information and what they believed was the birth mother's last name. Agreed to contact the physician, through whom the placement was made, in order to get any additional information he might have. Although the parents were successful in contacting the physician, he made it clear he would not provide additional information, even non-identifying information. He stated that to do so would violate the trust placed in him by the birth mother. As might be expected, Amy's response to this roadblock was frustration, anger, and depression. However, her ability to cope remained strong, at least for a while. With the help of her parents, she continued to search for information about her background. A private detective was even hired to locate families with the same name as the one they believed to belong to the birth mother. They also petitioned the court to require the physician to open his records on the case. Unfortunately, all efforts proved unsuccessful. After 2 frustrating years of searching, Amy's coping efforts weakened. She became more depressed, began to withdraw from her peers and her school studies, and projected much of her anger out onto her adoptive parents, who became a symbol of her relinquishment by her birth mother. Although Amy progressed well in therapy, she still struggles with a sense of emptiness within herself, as well as considerable anger and resentment at the adoption system, and which has prevented her from developing a fuller sense of who she is. So again, this is still happening today, and it is a huge problem. Anyway, we're moving on to interpersonal factors. Probably the most important interpersonal factors influencing the adopted child's adjustment are the experiences he or she has with family members. These experiences are related to the general quality of the caregiving environment, the adjustment of adoptive parents, and the way in which adoption issues are communicated between parents and children. In a review of adoption outcome research, Kadushin's 1980 study noted that children's successful adjustment to adoption is related to 2 general factors: parental attitudes towards the child and adoption, and the nature of the parent-child relationship. Specifically, acceptance of and satisfaction in adoptive parenthood, coupled with a warmth and accepting attitude toward the child, was generally predictive of positive adoption adjustment. By contrast, parental projection of the child, as well as parental dissatisfaction by the adoptive parenthood, typically were related to poor adjustment on the part of children. Similar findings have been reported in a recent longitudinal study on adjustment of adopted children by Hope's 1982 study. These findings, of course, parallel the role of parental caregiving characteristics in development and adjustment of non-adopted children, according to Maccabee and Martin's 1983 study. Other research has implicated the role of adoptive parent adjustment and the stability of the adoptive family in the well-being of adopted children. For example, a number of studies have noted that the biological vulnerabilities of adopted children, which were mentioned earlier in this chapter, are more likely to manifest themselves when one or both adoptive parents suffer from psychopathology or when there is a history of death, divorce, or desertion within the adoptive family. In addition to the issues of general parental adjustment, the well-being of adopted children is also assumed to be influenced by the parents' response to specific adoption-related issues. Kirk's 1964 study, and more recently Brodzinsky's 1987 and 1988 studies have suggested that children's adjustment to adoption is mediated by a host of factors associated with the transition to adoptive parenthood. For example, infertility, the uncertainty of the timing of the adoption process, the intrusiveness of the home study, the stigma associated with adoptive parenthood, the lack of readily available role models, among other factors, are viewed by these authors as additional stress confronting adoptive couples in their transition to parenthood, stresses which could very well have a negative impact on the parent-child relationship in the early years of the family life cycle. Moreover, as children get older, other adoption-related issues confront the family, including telling the child of his or her adoptive status, helping the child cope with the sense of loss, fostering a positive self-image as an adopted person, supporting the child's curiosity and need for information about the birth parents and his or her origins, and potentially handling the issues of searching for birth parents. As Brodzinsky's 1987 study has noted, these tasks provide the adoptive family with additional challenges that interact with the complicate and more universal tasks of family life, to the extent that adoptive parents are able to confront these issues openly and honestly. It is expected that they will be in a better position to foster more positive adjustment among the children. Related to these tasks of adoptive parenthood and the way in which parents and children communicate about adoption-related issues, Kirk's 1964 study, Classic Social Role Theory of Adoption Adjustment, suggests that a fundamental issue for the adoptive families is the way they handle the inherent differences of adoptive family life. By differences, Kirk means that unique tasks, challenges, and conflicts, such as those outlined above, that differentiate adoptive from non-adoptive families, also seen in Brodzinsky's 1987 study. According to Kirk, some couples, in reacting to the role handicaps of adoptive parenthood, try to take the sting out of adoption by simulating non-adoptive family life as closely as possible. aka they don't tend to tell their children, and it's a problem, a huge problem. All right. In their interactions with their child, they communicate the importance of forgetting about of being adopted, as well as goes with it, as they themselves try to do. This pattern of behavior has labeled rejection of difference, RD. By contrast, other parents openly confront the differences associated with adoption. These individuals seek to resolve the challenges and conflicts of adoptive family life by more active and direct involvement with the issues. They also allow themselves and their children the freedom and opportunity to express the feelings of being different and occasionally arise in the course of life experiences. Kirk has labeled this pattern acknowledgement of difference, AD. Within Kirk's theory, these two patterns represent a continuum of attitudes and communicative behavior, with the acknowledgement of difference pole more closely associated with optimal adjustment to among family members, and the rejection of difference pole more often tied to problems and adjustment. Thus, Kirk suggests that rejection of difference behavior tends to inhibit the development of an accepting and trusting family atmosphere, an atmosphere conducive to open and honest exploration of adoption-related issues. He also suggests that this communicative pattern tends to reinforce in the child the idea that to feel different is to be deviant. In turn, both these consequences can have a significant impact on the self-esteem and general adjustment of the adopted child. For example, consider the case of Tony, an 11-year-old Korean boy adopted at 4 by his Caucasian family. Tony was referred for treatment because his uncommunicativeness, mild depression, self-esteem problems, and academic underachievement. In the initial family session, it became immediately clear that Tony's parents had difficulty discussing the issue of adoption, especially in his presence. They indicated that their family was no different from any other family, and that the adoption played little or no role in Tony's difficulties. To support their belief, they stated that Tony seldom questioned them about being adopted and showed no interest in his origins. They believed he had made an excellent adjustment to their family and to being adopted. When I expressed surprise that Tony was so uninterested in such an important part of his life, he began to fidget and appeared quite uncomfortable. This behavior was pointed out both to his parents and to him. When asked what it might mean, his mother indicated that I was putting ideas into his head and making him uncomfortable. That is, I was suggesting that adoption should be important to him when it was not. At this point, Tony was asked directly to comment on his mother's interpretation. With some hesitancy, he stated that being adopted was important to him, that it always had been. With encouragement, he was able to acknowledge that he thought a great deal about his previous life in Korea and what it would be like if he still lived there, where his birth parents were, and if they ever thought of him. Needless to say, Tony's comments were a surprise and revelation to his parents. With support, though, they gradually were able to accept the reality and normality of Tony's feelings. This led to a more open, flexible, and less conflict-ridden pattern of communication in the family, which in turn facilitated a freer expression of grief on Tony's part for all that he had lost, as well as a greater sense of connectedness of his adoptive parents. Although Kirk's 1964 study has suggested a linear relationship between the continuum of acknowledgement of difference and the psychological well-being of adoptive families, Brodzinsky's 1987 study has recently argued that the relationship actually is covalent. That is, parents who adopt extreme views at either end of the belief continuum are assumed to foster poor adjustment among their adopted children. For example, in clinical studies, the author has worked with numerous families who have been characterized as an insistence of difference, i.e., coping pattern. in which families, parents, and occasionally children not only acknowledge the inherent differences of adoptive family life, but emphasize the differences such as an extent that they become the major focus of the family. In turn, this pattern often leads family members to view adoption as the basis for family disharmony and disconnectedness. Moreover, in such cases, it is quite common for parents to promote an unfavorable view of the biological backgrounds and their background. Of the biological parents and their background, and consequently resort to the bad seed or genetic explanations for the child's behavior and emotional problems, thereby allowing the parents to avoid their own share of the responsibility to the family's difficulty. To date, attempts to test Kirk's theory of adoption adjustment have yielded mixed results. In his original work, Kirk's 1964 study reported that parents who were characterized by the AD pattern were more likely to be empathetic to their child's feelings, to think more often about the child's birth parents, to feel greater satisfaction as adoptive parents, and to communicate more openly with their children. No measures of the child's adjustment, however, were included in the study. Carroll's 1968 study also examined the relationship between adoptive parents' coping strategies and aspects of their personal adjustment. He noted that prospective adoptive parents who tended to use an AD open strategy were more likely to report dissatisfaction with the selective aspects of their self-concept compared with individuals who used an RD strategy. Although the result would appear to contradict Kirk's position, Carroll argued that the intensity and scope of their AD subjects expressed self-dissatisfaction were well within the line of normality and seemed logical to reflect a more realistic and genuine self-appraisal. Thus, Carroll interpreted these results as supportive of Kirk's social role theory of adoption adjustment. Several recent studies have examined the relationship between adoptive parent coping strategies and children's adjustments. For example, Brodzinsky's 1987 study found that adoptive mothers who displayed an ID coping pattern had children who were rated lower in social competence and higher in behavioral problems than children whose mothers adopted an AD-RD or mixed AD-RD pattern. Furthermore, parents who adopted an ID pattern also rated their children as well as themselves and their spouses as less well-adjusted in adoption than mothers who displayed the other three coping styles. Interestingly, an insistence of difference pattern was also associated with a greater emphasis on hereditary as opposed to environmental as an explanation for children's personality and adjustment. Finally, mothers who displayed an RD pattern scored higher on the Krohn-Marlow social desirability scale than the mothers who displayed either AD or an ID pattern, thereby suggesting that rejection of difference may be part of a more global defensiveness pattern within certain adoptive parents rather than a pattern that is specific to adoption-related matters. In research, Kai, which will be chapter 7, also failed to support Kirk's position regarding the detrimental effect on RD coping pattern, and conversely, the beneficial effect of an AD pattern. The observational study of adoptive family interaction suggested, in fact, that the rejection of difference, at least in certain families, may actually reflect the absence of serious family problems, whereas acknowledgement of difference may indicate their existence. This finding must be viewed cautiously, however, particularly in light of the fact that the subject sample was skewed toward a super middle class population. how are we to reconcile the findings of Brodzinsky and Reeves' 1987 study in Kai, which again will be chapter 7, with Kirk's theory of adoption adjustment? If the findings of these two studies are valid, then it appears that the rejection of difference is not necessarily a detrimental coping pattern. In fact, it may well be a beneficial one, at least under certain conditions. One possible resolution to this dilemma lies in the relationship between an RD coping pattern and the process of denial, which is assumed to vary with it. Lazarus Folkman's 1984 study notes that although denial generally is considered to be an ineffective coping response under certain conditions, it does lead to adaptive outcomes. For example, when there is nothing constructive that can be done to overcome the harm or threat, that is, when the situation is perceived as unchangeable, denial can be useful for alleviating the person's distress. Furthermore, they state that denial may be adaptive for certain aspects of the problem, but not for the whole. In addition, the timing of denial may be significant in undermining its usefulness. These researchers argue that in the early stages of crisis, when the situation cannot be faced, at least in its entirety, denial may be beneficial. By contrast, the same coping process may become detrimental to the person if it persists beyond a certain point in time. In line with this last point, Brodzinsky's 1987 study suggests that the effectiveness of the adoptive parents' coping efforts must be viewed within the context of family life cycle tasks. In the initial stages of the family life cycle, when children are still very young, an RD coping pattern may serve the family well by supporting the primary socialization goals of building family unity, connectedness, and interpersonal trust. However, in later stages of the family life cycle, when children are struggling to understand the meaning of being adopted and the basis of their relinquishment, an RD coping pattern may well interfere with the open and honest parent-child communication, thereby leading to detrimental outcomes. Support for family life cycle changes and adoptive parent coping patterns have been reported by Brodzinsky and Jakowicz's 1987 study. These researchers found that although an RD coping pattern was quite common among parents who had infants and toddlers, it increased in intensity among parents who had older children. By contrast, parents with preschool and school-aged children tended to adopt an AD or mixed AD-RD coping pattern. Finally, an ID pattern was seldom observable except in families with adolescents. In summary, although present models suggest that adoptive parents' coping strategies are particularly important in understanding children's adoption adjustment, it is still unclear just how, when, and under what conditions these coping strategies impact on children's adaptational outcomes. It remains for future research to unravel these complex relationships. Alright guys, we are almost done with this chapter. Children's coping efforts. Having outlined the developmental implications of the interface between children's appraisal of adoption and various person-related variables, as well as the potential impact of biological and environmental factors on this interface, let us return to the issue of specific coping efforts displayed by children in their adjustment to adoption. As noted earlier, Lazarus and Folkman, 1984, have identified two broad categories of coping behaviors. One, problem-focused efforts, which are geared toward managing or altering the problem causing the distress, and two, emotion-focused efforts, which are geared toward regulating the individual's emotional response to the problem at hand. Although clinical experience suggests that children manifest a wide range of coping behaviors in dealing with their adoption experiences to date, there has been no systematic empirical work in this area. In fact, examination of developmental trends in children's coping behaviors in areas other than adoption has only recently been undertaken in a 1988 study, 1985, and 1987 study. This research suggests that children as young as 6 years are aware of stress in their lives and are able to report on specific efforts to cope with it. The data also indicates that children more often utilize problem solving rather than emotion management strategies, as well as those strategies involving overt and directly modes of action. Conversely, as children get older, there is increased use of emotion management and interpsychic modes of coping. Not surprising, the findings also suggest that the use of coping strategies varies considerably from one situation to another, according to Brandon Wise' 1988 study. The results of the research were in line with clinical observations of the coping behavior of adopted children. When children are first informed of their adoptive status, there's much question asking. Information regarding the birth parents and the reasons for their relinquishment typically are sought by the adoptive parents. Sought from the adoptive parents. In addition, children often seek emotional support from their parents. By contrast, strategies for regulating or managing emotions are less often seen in the early phases of adoption adjustment. As children enter middle childhood, however, there is a gradual increase in emotion-focused coping, denial avoidance, minimization, cognitive reappraisal, and so forth, and are just some of the strategies commonly employed by increase in emotion-focused coping. Probably reflects a growing recognition on the part of the child that little can be done to modify the circumstances represented by their adoptive parents, according to Lazarus and Folkman's 1984 study. Although the use of emotion management strategies appears to increase with age, clinical observations suggest that problem-focused strategies continue to play an important role in the adjustment of older adopted children. The nature of these latter coping strategies, however, may well change with age. Whereas preschool and early school age children typically engage in direct action, such as information seeking and support mobilization, older children frequently display inhibition of action. That is, they often purposely hold back to otherwise limit actions, impulses, or behaviors in an effort to cope with the adoption-related stress. For example, it is quite common for children who were once very curious about their adoption to appear now as uninvolved or disinterested in this aspect of their life. This change is reflected in the decline of adoption-related questions commonly reported by parents or of older school-aged children. A more dramatic example of inhibition of action is represented by the case of Cindy, a 12-year-old child adopted at the age of 16 months. After 2 years of pressuring her parents to allow her to search for her birth family, including 2 known birth siblings, Cindy repeatedly sabotaged the search process thereby reducing her level of anxiety by her own lack of action when the adoptive parents finally agree to assist her. Although it is obvious from a clinical experience that children display a wide range of coping behaviors in response to adoption related stress, the nature of the relationship between their cognitive appraisal of adoption and the use of specific coping strategies remains elusive. So too does the relationship between specific coping behaviors and various adaptational outcomes. These issues and others, such as developmental trends in adopted children's coping, and represent priorities for future research. All right, so here's a brief summary and conclusion for the chapter. A brief review of the research literature suggests that adopted children are at an increased risk for psychological and academic problems in comparison to their non-adopted counterparts. These problems, however, generally do not manifest themselves until elementary school age years. Furthermore, it is clear that adopted children display a wide range of adjustment patterns, with only a minority presenting children of clinically significant symptomology. Indeed, most adopted children appear to cope quite well with their challenges, conflicts, and demands of adoptive family life. In attempting to explain the individual variation in adopted children's behaviors and development, a new model of the adoption adjustment was presented. The model represents an integration of the work of Lazarus and his colleagues in the area of stress and coping, and our own work on cognitive, developmental, and psychosocial factors in adoption adjustment. At the core of the model is an assumption that children's adjustment to adoption rests on their appraisal of and efforts to cope with a host of subtle but pervasive adoption-related losses. To date, the majority of our knowledge about the development of adopted children rests on casework and clinical observation, and a small body of theoretical research. Each of these sources of data, however, are unsatisfactory casework and clinical data because of problems of generalizability and lack of observer objectivity, and a theoretical research because of the lack of conceptual context within which to interpret the findings. In contrast, the present model offers the investigator a clear theoretical context with the substantial generative power to guide his or her empirical endeavors. Whether or not the model has integrative and explanatory power, however, remains to be seen. It is much too early to evaluate how well the model fits the data. It is the hope of the author, although, that this model and others like it may help bridge the historical and conceptual gap that exists between social service fields, which traditionally have dominated adoption and foster care, and more research-based disciplines such as psychology, psychiatry, and sociology, until the boundaries between these fields and disciplines can be more flexible and a productive level of cross-fertilization of ideas and objects can be achieved. Our understanding of the adjustment problems of adopted children and our capacity to meet their casework and clinical needs will surely be inadequate. So basically, what Brodzinsky just summarized is that there are different coping strategies that are used with adoptive parents, with clinicians, with adoptees, and it's a mix of of how parenting styles and information is out there, but also how well the child reacts to these things, and also the age of the child. Because as he stated, things can change by age, and that is exactly what a lot of us have been trying to explain, that children generally see adoption as this positive light, right? Adoptees, I should say, when they're young, and then they go through a phase where it's not, and then they may return to that positive phase again, and then it may break down again. So like it can change at any time. Anyway, that is the end of chapter 1. I know it's been a very long time. I will be uploading on Thursdays, so I will see you next week. Stay tuned. These chapters are very long, which is why the book following will be broken down even further. All right, guys, I hope you all have a fantastic week.